Chapter 29. The Placing of the Ku'ula on the Altar. On Friday morning, the first thought that came into Mr. Johnson's mind was to get the ku'ula and place it on the altar rock near the edge of the shoreline just below the lighthouse. Of course, he did not want to excite Mrs. Johnson. She was preparing breakfast, and Domingo was still in his room. He thought it the appropriate time to take the ku'ula to the altar. He walked to the back of the pickup truck and took the ku'ula wrapped in white cloth. He looked around. Nobody was watching, so he started on his way to the lighthouse. As he approached the altar rock, the sea was very calm, but it was low tide, so he took the rock back to the lighthouse and left it in the battery room. When the tide was low, the distance from the altar rock to the sea was about 10 feet. When the tide was high, the sea was around the altar rock. He remembered Kema telling his story about the ku'ula, and when it was placed on the altar, the fish swam around the altar, so it must have been high tide. He could not ask anyone who would tell him what would be the right way. No one was interested in the ku'ula, just Mr. Johnson. Thinking of the money he would receive from the sale of the fish, he said to himself, "This is the most exciting time of my life. I'll see if the ku'ula really works. If it does, then whatever happens, I am ready for it. Maybe it will be trivial. Whatever it is, I am ready to face it." He walked back to the house to have his breakfast. When they all had finished, Domingo said he would check the pickup. Mrs. Johnson asked her husband what happened the day before. He told her about the pickup truck giving trouble and that the engine would not start again. Mr. Johnson then looked at the calendar on the wall to see what time of the day the tide would be high. It showed the high tide at 10 o'clock, and it was then only 8 o'clock. He went out to the pickup truck to see Domingo and told him to take the ignition switch off and check the leads as soon as he was through cleaning the carburetor. Mr. Johnson left for the lighthouse to check his batteries to see if there was enough distilled water and if the reading of each cell was up. This would take him a good 2 hours, and by that time, the tide would be high, and he would take the ku'ula to the stone altar. He walked over to where he had placed the ku'ula and said to himself, "How can a small stone like this bring the school of fish to the altar? This is something I do not understand. But still, I will try and see if it does happen. It is just a plain, porous rock. I am as anxious as can be to see what will happen when I place the ku'ula on the altar. I still doubt that the fish will come. Maybe during Kema's time, but that was long ago. Then again, I have a funny feeling while looking at the ku'ula, and my mind says this is true, that the ku'ula will get the fish for me, and then my doubts fade away." In the meantime, Domingo worked on the ignition and pulled one lead out that showed it was broken, but he said he could fix it. Mr. Johnson looked at the time and then walked to the door and looked at the shoreline. It would still be another hour before high tide. He walked back to the ku'ula. Then he began to reflect about the placing of the ku'ula. When the tide was near the altar rock, it would be knee-deep. He would use the throwing net to catch the fish, then pull the net ashore and bag them in gunny sacks and fill them about half full. He had 4 places to deliver them: Waiohinu Coffee Shop, Shimizu Hotel at Naalehu, Mr. Siu's Coffee Shop at Honuapo, and Pahala Restaurant at Pahala. These were regular customers when he had a big catch. But still, he remembered that before he took the fish to fill the gunny sacks, he must place the first fish on the altar for the ku'ula. This would be his payment in appreciation and nothing more. He must do this because it was the custom, and to whoever came to the beach while he was picking up the fish, he must give them at least 1 or 2 fish. This would give him a good omen. There was a lot more to remember. The rest of the fish must be taken to another village to exchange for vegetables if they were plentiful. These were the requirements when you received from a ku'ula. If you received too much, you must share with others and receive in exchange something you don't have, such as vegetables or any kind of food. There was no exchange in money ever received. These were the things that Mr. Johnson heard as he listened to stories told by Mr. Kema and others while he was drinking beer at Shimizu's beer bar. With all this in mind, he had a clear view of what to do when he received the fish. If he carried out the intent of the ku'ula as it was laid down, it would turn out all right. But that strange feeling was still hounding him. He could not see but only feel that there was someone around him. He tried to think otherwise, but it was still there. Sometimes he would talk to himself, saying, "Show your image so I can see you." But no sign appeared. The time drew near when he was about to take the ku'ula. He once more walked to the door to look at the sea near the altar rock. Just a few feet more, and it would be time. He went in and sat on the chair. This time, he would wait until exactly 10 o'clock. He left the battery room and walked over to see Domingo about his work on the pickup truck. Domingo said he would be finished in about an hour. Mr. Johnson then checked to see if the gunny sacks and the throw net were ready. He walked into the kitchen and got a cup of black coffee. In walked Mrs. Johnson, who said, "I see you are drinking coffee. I thought you were busy and forgot it." He replied, "I just have a minute, but I have to leave and go back to my work." When he came to the door of the lighthouse, he looked at the altar rock. The waves were washing over it. It was time to place the ku'ula on the altar. He walked straight to the table, picked up the ku'ula, and walked out of the battery room. With both hands holding the rock tight, he walked down to the beach to the altar rock and set the ku'ula on it. He straightened up and stood before the altar. He waited, and in just about 15 minutes, the place was full of fish. Mr. Johnson was astounded. He didn't believe this would happen. He said to himself, "I see this is real and wonder if I am dreaming or not. I want to run and tell the good news and at the same time not say anything." He waited a little while until he regained his composure. Then he made straight for the garage and picked up the net and the gunny sacks and walked back to the ku'ula. He laid the gunny sacks down, opened his throw net, and heaved it out on the school of fish. He pulled his net together and brought the net and the fish trapped inside to the shore. It was really heavy. He threw it on the ground and opened it and began to fill the sacks about half full. He filled 2 sacks, then shook his net to clear off some seaweed that clung to it. He threw the net for a second time over the school of fish. This time, he used 4 gunny sacks, half full. He was now ready to take the fish to the restaurants. In all his excitement, he forgot to place 1 fish on the altar. His mind was only thinking how much money he was going to receive. He shook his net again and stretched it on the ground to dry. He walked to the garage, and Domingo was not there. He was in the kitchen drinking coffee. He asked Domingo if the pickup truck was all repaired, and he said it was. He told Domingo to drink his coffee as they were leaving for Waiohinu right away. He tried not to get excited over the fish. He walked into the laundry room and told Mrs. Johnson the news. She was so happy. He said, "I am leaving now, and I'll eat in Naalehu, and will return before dark. I have 4 places to deliver the fish." Then Mr. Johnson went to the pickup truck and put the tarpaulin in the back. Domingo didn't know whether to ask him about the fish or not. Domingo started the truck. and Mr. Johnson told him to drive around the lighthouse as he had ahole to take to deliver. It dawned on Domingo then that this was what Mr. Johnson had been doing all the time. He stopped the pickup truck, and Mr. Johnson got out and picked up the sacks of fish and put them in the back of the truck. Domingo was looking out where the ku'ula was placed and saw the school of fish around it. He was amazed as he had not seen anything like it before. Mr. Johnson got in the truck and told Domingo to stop first at Waiohinu Coffee Shop, then Mr. Kupahu's house and the Shimizu Hotel. Then they would go on to Mr. Siu's coffee shop at Honuapo and the Pahala Coffee Shop and return home before the sun set. About halfway to the first stop, Mr. Johnson was relaxed and laid his head back and thought about what the future held for him. Sometimes he laughed to himself. As they were nearing Waiohinu, Mr. Johnson spoke. "Well, our first business is at Waiohinu Coffee Shop. I will take the fish in to see how much they weigh." The manager saw Mr. Johnson and spoke to him. "How come you are up here?" He replied, "I have a surprise for you. I have a half bag of ahole for you." The manager said, "This will be a change in my menu. I am very glad to receive the fish." The half bag of ahole weighed 60 pounds. His first take was $10.20. He was so happy. He decided he had better have something to eat, so he called Domingo to come and have lunch. The manager fried 2 fish for their lunch. They were very tasty and moist. He paid for the lunch and started off for Naalehu. He did not tell the manager how he caught the ahole. There were some old Hawaiian women at the coffee shop. Hearing that the shop had just received a half bag of fish, they wanted to buy some. The manager said that the price was high. They said, "Never mind the price, just give us 1 ahole." One of the women looked at the ahole and noticed at once how the fish was caught. She said, "The fish's gill show it was a throw net. This is a deep-sea fish, different from the offshore ahole as they are smaller in size. This is a ku'ula catch. I wonder how come he got the ku'ula. I thought this ku'ula was lost when the keeper died. I have eaten this kind of fish when I was a little girl. I am 75 now, and I am glad I can eat it again before I die. When I see Mr. Johnson, I will ask him." On the way to Naalehu, Mr. Johnson was thinking of what he could do now that he had the ku'ula. He said to Domingo, "You and I are going to be very busy. I am thinking of doing some fish drying to take them to the camp to sell." He looked out of the window and saw they were approaching Mr. Kupahu's residence. Upon arriving, he picked up 5 ahole and took them to the back of the house. The door was open, so he walked in and called for Mr. Kupahu. He came to the kitchen, and Mr. Johnson asked where Mr. Joe Fat was. Mr. Kupahu said that I was back in the garden. He told Mr. Kupahu he had something for me to try. Mr. Kupahu received the fish and thanked Mr. Johnson, who then went to Mr. Shimizu's hotel next to Mr. Kupahu's. Domingo drove the pickup truck to the back and stopped at the kitchen door. Mr. Johnson took the bag of fish to the kitchen, and Mr. Shimizu looked in the bag and asked what it was. He put it on the scale, and the bag weighed 70 pounds. He said, "How come you caught all these aholes?" Mr. Johnson replied, "I just got lucky and spotted the school." Mr. Shimizu said, "I heard about these fish at Kalai. I have eaten them once, and I think it was Mr. Kema who brought them to me. I am glad I have the chance to eat them again. It seems that this fish was famous in those days. As you can see, when the old folks see them, they want to try them again. If you have more of these fish, bring them to me, as I have a big icebox and can keep them a long time." Mr. Johnson said, I am glad you spoke about that. Maybe I will do just that. I will stop at the bar and drink a few beers with Domingo, and then on to Honuapo and Pahala. I have a long way to go. After he and Domingo drank their beer, they headed on their way. In the meantime, I came back from the garden with some onions and tomatoes. Mr. Kupahu called me and said, "Your cousin was here, and he brought some fish." I asked him what kind of fish, and he told me it was ahole. I said it must be the fish out in the deep ocean. I went to the sink and looked at the fish. I looked at the gills and could see that the fish were caught by a throw net, not out in the deep ocean. I figured that Mr. Johnson must have the ku'ula. Mr. Kupahu knew all about these fish, but did not want to say anything to me because he knew I would ask him all kinds of questions. He thought the less he said, the better it was. I tried to tell him that his experience would help us to know all about our heritage, but I could not make him understand. He also said this fish was not good to eat and that it was dangerous to eat it. I asked why, but I could not get an answer to satisfy me. So I was wondering, what would happen to these fish I got from Mr. Johnson? Was he going to throw them away because they were brought in by a ku'ula rock? This was not so, as Elena, his granddaughter, cleaned and scaled all the fish and boiled them in one big pot with a dash of Hawaiian salt. That evening, she set the plate of fish on the table. I wondered if Mr. Kupahu was going to eat it. I took one fish on my plate and sat down to eat it with my onions and tomatoes. It was delicious. I had already eaten about half of the fish when I saw Mr. Kupahu pulling the dish toward him and putting a fish on his plate. He could not stand the urge to eat the ahole he longed for. I was glad that this one time, his Hawaiian culture overcame his missionary warning. After lunch, we sat in the living room. I looked at him and spoke. "What made you eat the fish? You know this missionary teaching is all right for the ahole, but not for the Hawaiian. You have your belief and I respect it. Now you ate the fish and nothing is wrong with that." This is the thing that I am trying to tell you. You must not refrain from letting me know what you learned when you were young. All I want to know is what it was like. There are lots of good and bad on both sides. This is what we want to understand. It will help us in our future everyday relationship. Mr. Kupahu understood what I was trying to say. All this time, he refused to repeat anything that had anything to do with a ku'ula rock. Later, he consented to tell me what I wanted to know. I came out and walked to the bar to see if I could meet Mr. Johnson. They told me he had just left for Mr. Siu's coffee shop. I went back to the house, hoping he would stop by on his return from Pahala. Mr. Johnson arrived at Mr. Siu's coffee shop at Honuapo. Mr. Siu was glad to accept the fish. For some time he had been out of fish because the weather had been so rough that the fishermen could not go out. Mr. Johnson asked if he might bring some more fish the next week, as he had to save the rest he had for his last stop, Pahala. When they arrived at Pahala, Mr. Johnson took the last bag of fish into the kitchen. The Chinese cook looked at the fish with surprise. This was the first time he had seen ahole as big as a mullet. Mr. Johnson told him this ahole stayed out about 3 miles in the ocean, and once in a while they came in schools, and this is how he caught them. The cook said he would try to steam cook the fish Chinese style. After receiving his money, Mr. Johnson and Domingo headed for Kalai. On the way home, Mr. Johnson was daydreaming. He was so happy that something good had come into his life and there was more money to be had. When he and Domingo arrived at Kalai, the sun was just about to set. Mr. Johnson said to Domingo, "I'll get out here and go to the lighthouse and turn on the light, and you can take the pickup truck and park it in the garage, and call it a day. Mr. Johnson looked at the Ku'ula rock. The school of fish was still there. He closed the door of the lighthouse and walked home.